The year was 1925, and the world spun to the dizzying, syncopated rhythm of a jazz saxophone. Nowhere did it spin faster than in the grand ballroom of the Beaumont mansion on Long Island's Gold Coast. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and French perfume, vibrated with laughter and the clinking of crystal coupes overflowing with champagne that shouldn't exist. It was the age of gilded nonsense, of fortunes made and spent in a heartbeat, and tonight Evelyn Beaumont was its undisputed queen. She moved through the throng of bodies like a whispered secret, her gown of silver beads and silk fringe shimmering under the electric glare of a dozen chandeliers, clung to a slender frame, a second skin of starlight, its hem dancing just below her knees in a perfect, scandalous flapper silhouette. A diamond band held her dark bobbed hair in place, framing a face that was the envy of every debutante, from Manhattan to Newport. But it was her eyes, the color of warm whiskey, intelligent and full of a restless fire, that held the real magic. They promised wit, passion, and a life lived without apology. At her side, impossibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, was Walter DeWitt. His arm rested possessively at the small of her back, his smile a gleaming advertisement for the American dream. He was heir to a banking dynasty, a man whose future was as solid and unassailable as the vaults beneath his father's Wall Street firm. Their engagement was the talk of the season, a perfect merger of old money and new vitality. To the world, they were everything the Roaring Twenties promised: youth, beauty, and limitless wealth. "Darling, you've outdone yourself," Walter murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Even the asters would be green with envy." Evelyn smiled, a practiced, perfect curve of her lips. "It's just a party, Walter. It's never just a party with you." "Evelyn," he corrected, his blue eyes sweeping the room with an air of ownership. "It's a statement, a declaration that the Beaumonts are, and always will be, the center of this universe." She felt a flicker of unease at his words, a subtle possessiveness that had been growing more pronounced in recent weeks. But she quickly dismissed it, attributing it to the heady excitement of their impending nuptials. She was a Beaumont. Her father, Harold Beaumont, was a titan of industry, a man who had built an empire from grit and vision. Their universe was secure. The band slid into a sultry, blues-infused number, and the dance floor became a swirling kaleidoscope of color and movement. Evelyn laughed, a sound like wind chimes, and let Walter lead her into the fray. They moved together with the effortless grace of those born to the spotlight, their bodies a testament to privilege and practice. For a few minutes, lost in the music and the heat of the moment, she was truly happy. The world was her oyster, and she wore its pearl on a string round her neck. From a shadowed alcove near the French doors that led to the moonlit gardens, a man watched. He was not like the others. His tuxedo was dark, impeccably cut, but it sat on his broad shoulders with a different kind of authority, not inherited, but seized. His name was Stanley Kovac, and his presence in this palace of pedigrees was an anomaly, a crack in the polished veneer. No one knew who had invited him, but no one dared to ask him to leave. His face was all sharp angles and quiet intensity, his dark eyes missing nothing. He didn't watch the party. He dissected it, his gaze assessing the flow of power and influence with the cool calculation of a predator. He had been watching Evelyn Beaumont all night. He had seen the practiced smile, the easy grace, the way she commanded the room without effort. She was a gilded angel, a creature of light and air. But unlike the fawning young men who orbited her, Stanley saw something else beneath the diamonds and the silk. He saw a flicker of steel in her whiskey-colored eyes, a sharp intelligence that her frivolous world did its best to ignore. As the song ended, Walter held Evelyn a moment longer, his hand tightening on hers. He led her toward the small raised dais where the band played, a strange, determined look on his face. He picked up a silver fork and tapped it against his champagne coupe. The sharp, clear ring cut through the din of conversation, slowly hushing the room. A wave of anticipation rippled through the guests. An announcement? Perhaps the wedding date? Evelyn looked at him, a question in her eyes. This was not planned. Walter's smile was blindingly bright, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the now silent ballroom. "Thank you all for joining the Beaumonts and me tonight. It is a night for celebration, but also for clarity." A confused murmur went through the crowd. "Clarity. We live in an age of progress, an age of truth," Walter continued, his tone becoming colder, more theatrical. "And in that spirit, there is a truth that must be shared." He turned his gaze on Evelyn, and for the first time, she saw no warmth there, only a chilling, reptilian calculation. "Our engagement," he announced, his voice like the crack of a whip, "is over." A collective gasp swept the room. It was a physical thing, a sudden void of air. Evelyn's heart stopped. The blood drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the pearls at her throat. She stared at Walter, certain she had misheard, that this was some cruel, inexplicable joke. "Walter, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He ignored her, addressing the rapt audience of their peers. "A union, particularly a union like ours, must be built on a foundation of stability, of honor, of solvency." He let the last word hang in the air, a poisoned dart. "And I have been made aware, through channels of unimpeachable authority, that the foundation of the House of Beaumont is no longer stone, but sand. In fact, it has crumbled entirely." The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was the silence of scandal, the silence of a public execution. He had not just broken their engagement, he had stripped her and her family bare in front of the very people who defined their world. He was announcing their ruin due to a series of disastrous investments and, let's call it, creative accounting on the part of Harold Beaumont, Walter said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The Beaumont fortune is gone. Every last dollar." Evelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It couldn't be true. Her father, he was infallible, but the looks on the faces around her told a different story. The shock was rapidly being replaced by something else. Pity, yes, but also a cold, calculating distance. Eyes that had adored her moments ago now slid away, refusing to meet her gaze. Whispers erupted like brush fires, venomous, excited whispers. The gilded angel had fallen, and the spectacle was riveting. I cannot, in good conscience, tether the DeWitter name to such instability, Walter concluded, his performance complete. He dropped Evelyn's hand as if it were contaminated. I wish you the best of luck, Miss Beaumont. He turned and strode off the dais, the crowd parting for him as if he were Moses and they the Red Sea. He didn't look back. Evelyn stood frozen, a statue of shattered porcelain in the center of the room. The jazz band, unsure of what to do, remained silent. The party was over. Her life, as she knew it, was over. She could feel the 100 pairs of eyes on her, not with admiration, but with a morbid curiosity. She was no longer a person. She was a cautionary tale, a piece of gossip to be savored and spread before morning. The friends she had laughed with an hour ago now huddled in corners, their backs turned to her. She was a pariah. Her gaze swept the room in a desperate, panicked search for a single friendly face, a lifeline. She found none. They were all strangers, their faces masks of polite horror or unconcealed glee. Her world, once so vast and brilliant, had shrunk to this single, suffocating moment of humiliation. And then her eyes landed on the shadowed alcove. He was still there, Stanley Kovac. He had not moved. Unlike everyone else, He was not whispering or looking away. His dark, intense eyes were fixed directly on her, but there was no pity in his gaze, no scorn. There was something else, something she couldn't name, a flicker of recognition perhaps. As if he were not seeing a ruined heiress or a fallen angel. He was seeing a fighter, cornered and bleeding, but not yet broken. He saw the steel she had never been forced to use. For a single breathless second, their gazes locked across the ruins of her life. In that moment, the noisy, treacherous ballroom faded away, and there were only the two of them, the girl who had just lost everything, and the man who had built an empire from nothing. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared in her consciousness, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and melted back into the shadows, disappearing through the French doors into the cool darkness of the night. He was gone, leaving Evelyn alone, utterly alone, to face the wreckage of her perfect, gilded world. The 6 weeks that followed the party were a masterclass in social and financial gravity. The Beaumont name, once a key that opened every door, was now a lead weight, dragging Evelyn down into a world she had only ever read about in grim, cautionary novels. The Long Island mansion, with its silent, dust-sheeted rooms, was seized by the banks. Her father, a broken and hollowed-out man, had retreated to a small, borrowed room in a distant relative's country house, his silence a wall she could not penetrate. Her friends had evaporated like morning mist, their telephone lines perpetually busy, their invitations mysteriously lost in the mail. The world she had commanded had not just shunned her, it had erased her. Humiliation was a constant companion, but desperation was a far more demanding one. It was desperation that now guided her worn leather shoes over the cracked cobblestones of a part of the city where the street lamps seemed to shy away from the darkness. The air here was different, thick with the smells of coal smoke, damp wool, and the greasy promise of cheap food from street carts. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and saltwater breezes of her past. She clutched her worn coat tighter, her last decent one, and checked the address scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper one more time. The place had no sign, merely a heavy, unmarked oak door set into the brick facade of a nondescript warehouse. Above it, a single grime-covered window reflected the weak moonlight. This was the address she had pried from a former stable-boy, a whisper of a place known only to those who sought it, the Gilded Cage, Stanley Kovac's place. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. Every instinct of her breeding screamed at her to turn back, to run from this sordid, dangerous corner of the city. But where would she run to? There was nothing behind her anymore. With a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm her nerves, she raised a gloved hand and knocked. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, a small, grated slit in the door slid open, and a pair of cold, suspicious eyes peered out. "Yeah?" a gravelly voice demanded. "I'm here to see Mr. Kovac," Evelyn said, amazed at how steady her own voice sounded. "He ain't seeing nobody." "Beat it." The slit started to slide shut. "Tell him it's Evelyn Beaumont," she said quickly, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. She half expected the man to laugh, to mock the fallen heiress begging at a gangster's door. Instead, the eyes narrowed. There was a pause, a moment of consideration. Then the grate slammed shut. She heard the heavy thud of multiple bolts being drawn back. The door creaked open just wide enough for her to slip through, and then slammed shut behind her, the bolts sliding home with a sound of chilling finality. The change in atmosphere was instantaneous and overwhelming. If the ballroom of her former life had been a symphony of light and air, this was a subterranean opera of shadow and smoke. The room was vast, a converted warehouse space filled with small, intimate tables cloaked in darkness. The air was a haze of cigarette smoke, so thick it seemed to swallow the light from the low-hanging lamps. It smelled of spilled gin, sweat, and a heady, dangerous perfume. On a small stage at the far end of the room, a woman in a velvet dress sang a slow, mournful blues number, her voice a river of liquid sorrow that flowed through the smoky darkness. The clientele was a world away from the polished dandies and preenings debutantes she knew. These were men with hard faces and watchful eyes, their expensive suits unable to hide the pugnacious set of their shoulders. The women with them were beautiful, yes, but with a brittle, knowing edge that Evelyn had never encountered. This was not a party. It was a gathering of predators and survivors, and she was an alien creature here, a canary in a wolf's den. The mountain of a man who had opened the door. A brute named Mickey, she would later learn, grunted and jerked his head toward a staircase in the back. He's up there. Don't waste his time. Evelyn walked through the room feeling 100 pairs of eyes on her. The whispers followed her, sharp and dissecting. Beaumont? Ain't that the one who went bust? Look at her. Like a lost little bird, she kept her chin high, her spine straight, channeling the last dregs of the Beaumont pride. She was an actress on a terrifying new stage, and her performance had to be flawless. Stanley Kovac's office was a stark contrast to the opulent chaos below. It was a large, quiet room, lined with bookshelves filled not with ledgers, but with works of history, philosophy, and poetry. A large mahogany desk stood before a wide window that overlooked the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. And behind that desk, watching her enter with those same dark, unreadable eyes from the party, sat Stanley. He didn't rise. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that seemed at odds with the violence of his reputation. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" She sat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Now that she was here, words failed her. The carefully rehearsed speech she had prepared seemed absurd, pathetic. He waited, his patience a form of pressure. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating the sharp planes of his face, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps not yet 30, but his eyes held the weary cynicism of a much older man. "I need a job," she finally said, the words coming out in a rush. Stanley took a slow drag from his cigarette, letting the smoke curl from his lips before he spoke. "A job. The Gilded Cage is not a charity, Miss Beaumont. We don't have positions for society girls looking for a thrill." "I am no longer a society girl," she retorted, a flash of her old fire returning. "And I assure you, I am not looking for a thrill. I'm looking to survive. I can sing, I can play the piano, I can greet guests, I can pour drinks. I will do anything." He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. His gaze was so intense it felt as if he were peeling back the layers of her composure, searching for the truth beneath. "You think pouring illegal hooch for thugs and their dames is a suitable line of work for a Beaumont?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I think being hungry and homeless is even less suitable," she shot back. "My name is worthless now. My reputation is shattered. I have nothing left to lose." "Everyone has something left to lose," he said softly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was not a threat, but a statement of fact, a law of his universe. Tears of frustration and shame pricked at the back of her eyes, and she fought them down fiercely. Crying was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her hand went to the thin gold chain around her neck. It was her last possession of any value, the last remnant of her old life. It was a delicate locket her mother had given her, containing tiny, faded portraits of her parents on their wedding day. With trembling fingers she unclasped it and laid it on the polished surface of his desk. The small piece of gold seemed to glow in the lamplight. "This is all I have," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's from the 17th century. It's worth a great deal. Take it. In exchange, give me a job. Any job." She had laid her last defense, her final piece of her past, on his desk. It was an act of total surrender. Stanley looked down at the locket, then back up at her face. The flicker of amusement was gone, replaced by that same unreadable intensity she had seen at the party. He did not move to touch the locket. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not a gangster or a predator, but a man who understood, on a fundamental level, what it meant to have nothing. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the desk. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken weight of her desperation and his decision. "Keep your mother's locket, Miss Beaumont," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. He pushed the delicate piece of jewelry back across the desk toward her. "You will not be pouring drinks, and you will not be singing for your supper." Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar sensation, fluttered in her chest. "Then, what?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. A decision had been made, a pact was being offered. "The woman who ran the books and managed the front of the house for me. She recently retired." "Unexpectedly," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a grim smile. "The position is open. You're educated. You're intelligent. You understand the kind of people who have money and the kind of people who want it. You'll manage the club." "My club?" Evelyn stared at him, stunned into silence. A manager? It was absurd. It was impossible. She knew nothing of this world, of his business. It was a lifeline, yes, but it was a lifeline thrown into the deepest, darkest part of the ocean. "You'll answer to me, and only to me," he continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll see everything. You'll hear everything, and you will be loyal. In my world, Miss Beaumont, loyalty is not a virtue. It is currency. The only currency that matters." He stood up, a tall, imposing shadow against the glittering backdrop of the city. "The job is yours, if you want it." She looked from his unyielding face to the locket still lying on the desk. He was offering her a choice, to cling to the ghost of her past, or to step into a future she could not possibly imagine. But it was not really a choice at all. Her hand closed around the warm gold of the locket, her last tie to the girl she used to be. She tucked it back beneath her dress, a secret anchor against her skin. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong. Stanley gave a single decisive nod. "Good. You start tomorrow night." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. "Welcome to the gilded cage, Evelyn." As she walked out of his office and back down the stairs, the mournful blues song had been replaced by a frantic, high-energy jazz number. The world below was just as dangerous, the faces just as hard. But something had changed. She was no longer an outsider looking in. The heavy oak door had not just been a barrier, it was the entrance to a cage, and whether for protection or imprisonment, she had just willingly walked inside. The gilded cage operated on its own clock, a nocturnal rhythm that Evelyn learned with the speed of a desperate scholar. Days were for sleeping, afternoons for accounting, and nights for holding court in the kingdom of shadows. Her office, a cramped space tucked behind the main bar, became her sanctuary. The click and clatter of the adding machine replaced the memory of piano sonatas, and she found a strange, satisfying solace in the rigid logic of numbers. She was not just a figurehead, she was an architect. Stanley Kovac's business, while brutally effective, was a chaos of cash-stuffed envelopes and cryptic notations on cocktail napkins. Evelyn tamed it. With the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to planning a charity gala, she implemented a system of ledgers, tracked inventory, and identified suppliers who were skimming profits. Within a month, the club's efficiency had doubled, and a quiet, grudging respect began to form among the hardened men who worked for Stanley. Mickey, the behemoth at the door, had initially called her princess, his tone thick with derision. That ended the night she calmly pointed out that their primary supplier of Canadian whiskey was charging them 20% more than the market rate, and suggested an alternative source she had researched, a rival outfit Stanley had been meaning to approach. Stanley had listened, given a single sharp nod, and the deal was done the next day. After that, Mickey simply called her Miss Beaumont, his voice holding the same gruff deference he afforded Stanley himself. Her transformation was not merely administrative. She learned the language of the club, a dialect of glances, nods, and silences. She learned to spot a plainclothes policeman by the shine on his shoes and the way he never quite relaxed his shoulders. She learned to diffuse a drunken argument, not with force, but with a quiet word and a complimentary bottle for the right person. The grace that had made her a star in the ballrooms of Long Island was repurposed here, becoming a tool of command, a silken glove over an iron will. She was no longer a fallen angel. She was becoming the queen of this gilded cage. And through it all, there was Stanley. He was a constant, watchful presence. He would appear in her office doorway late at night, a spectre in smoke and shadow, and simply observe her work. He rarely spoke, but she felt his gaze, an intense, analytical force that seemed to see right through the competent facade to the still healing wounds beneath. Their conversations were brief, stripped to their essential core. "The gin shipment is short 2 crates, she'd report, not looking up from her ledger. "I'll handle it," he'd reply, and the next day 2 extra crates would appear. No questions asked. He was her mentor in this dark curriculum. One evening, as she watched him survey the crowded room from the top of the stairs, he spoke without looking at her. "See the man at the corner table? The one with the pinky ring?" She followed his gaze. "The one talking to the blonde. He's not talking to her, he's watching the door. He works for O'Malley," Stanley said, naming his chief rival. "He's counting how many of my top men are here tonight. He's looking for weakness." It was a lesson she took to heart. She learned to see the world as he did, a chessboard of threats and opportunities, where every move had a consequence. In return, she brought a sliver of light into his cynical existence. One afternoon, she placed a small vase with a single white rose on her desk. When Stanley saw it, he stopped, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but the rose remained, replaced each week, a silent acknowledgement of a world beyond violence and profit. A tension coiled between them in the quiet hours after the last customer had stumbled out into the pre-dawn gloom. It was in the way he would sometimes lean over her shoulder to look at a ledger, the scent of his cigarettes and bay rum filling her senses, the heat of his body a breath away from hers. It was in the way her heart would beat a little faster when she heard his heavy footstep approaching her office. There were 2 solitary planets, drawn into a dangerous, compelling orbit, each defined by the other's gravity. He was the darkness that had saved her, and she was the last remnant of light in his world. The first true test of their alliance came on a Tuesday night, when the club was humming with its usual energy. Evelyn was on the floor, moving between tables with a quiet authority, ensuring glasses were full and tempers were calm. And then, the heavy oak door opened, and a ghost from her past walked in. Walter DeWitt. He stood in the entryway, his immaculate dinner jacket and smug, handsome face, a jarring anachronism in the smoky den. He looked around with an expression of aristocratic disgust, as if he had just stepped in something unpleasant. His eyes scanned the room and finally landed on her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. He strode toward her, parting the crowd with the same entitled arrogance he had always possessed. Mickey took a step to intercept him, but Evelyn gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. This was her battle. "Evelyn, my dear," Walter said, his voice a condescending drawl that carried over the jazz music. "I must say, I never imagined I'd find you in a place like this. It's atmospheric." He made the words sound like an insult. "Walter," she replied, her voice perfectly even, betraying none of the turmoil that's seeing him ignited within her. "This is a private establishment. If you don't have a reservation, I'm afraid you'll have to leave." He chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Oh, I'm not here for the rot-gut gin. I was curious. I wanted to see how the other half lives. And to see you, of course. Tell me, what exactly is your position here? Are you one of the singers? Or perhaps something a bit more personal for the proprietor?" The insult was designed to strip her of her dignity, to remind her of how far she had fallen. The Evelyn of 6 weeks ago would have crumpled, but this Evelyn was forged in a different fire. She met his gaze without flinching, her whiskey-colored eyes turning to ice. "My position is ensuring that the establishment is not sullied by the presence of unwanted guests. If you're not here to purchase a drink, Mr. DeWitt, you're taking up valuable space." Walter's smile faltered. He was not accustomed to being dismissed. Still the fiery little debutante, he sneered, reaching out as if to touch her arm. Some things never change. Before his fingers could make contact, a shadow fell over their table. Neither of them had seen Stanley approach. He moved with a predator's silence, and his presence instantly changed the air around them, making it cold and thin. "Is there a problem here, Miss Beaumont?" Stanley asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. His eyes were not on Evelyn. They were locked on Walter. Walter quickly dropped his hand, a flicker of unease crossing his face as he took in the man before him. "No problem at all," he said, attempting a bravado he clearly did not feel. "Just catching up with an old acquaintance." "I see," Stanley said, his expression utterly flat. He took a small step forward, invading Walter's personal space. "My acquaintance is an asset to my business, and I protect my assets. When they are disturbed, my business is disturbed, and when my business is disturbed," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "I become very unhappy. Unfortunate accidents tend to happen to people who make me unhappy." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a single threatening gesture. But the menace in his calm, quiet words was more terrifying than any shout. It was the promise of a cold, efficient, and final resolution. Walter DeWitt, who had faced down titans of industry and boardrooms, visibly paled. He had blundered into a world whose rules he did not understand, and he was staring into the eyes of its king. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Walter stammered, taking a step back. "No," Stanley replied, his voice dropping even lower. "I think you understand me perfectly. Now, your curiosity is satisfied. Leave." It was not a request. Walter practically scrambled backward, his face a mask of fear and humiliation. He turned and fled toward the door, nearly stumbling over a chair in his haste. The patrons who had been watching the exchange turned away, a collective, unspoken agreement to have seen nothing. The jazz band struck up a new, lively tune, and the hum of the club resumed as if nothing had happened. Evelyn was left standing in the sudden vacuum of Stanley's protective silence. She was trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation coursing through her. He turned his dark eyes to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond business in them. It was a raw, possessive protectiveness. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice now stripped of its menace. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He had not just defended an employee. He had defended her. He had stood between her and the man who had destroyed her life and had made him run like a frightened child. "Thank you," she finally whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. Stanley simply gave that same sharp nod he had given her in the ballroom weeks ago. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of a pact now sealed not in desperation, but in loyalty. He had drawn a line in the sand around her, and in the heart of the city's underworld, he had just declared Evelyn Beaumont untouchable. Walter DeWitt's humiliating retreat did not go unnoticed in the city's nocturnal ecosystem. News traveled through the speakeasies and back alleys like a contagion, carried on the whispers of cigarette girls and the boasts of low-level thugs. Stanley Kovac had publicly shielded the fallen Beaumont heiress. He had drawn a line, and in doing so had turned Evelyn from a pitiable ghost into a figure of intense and dangerous speculation. She was no longer just a manager. She was Stanley's girl. And in their world, that meant she was both a fortress and a target. The change inside the gilded cage was palpable. The staff's respect now bordered on reverence, tinged with a healthy dose of fear for what Stanley might do to anyone who crossed her. But outside the club's heavy oak doors, a different kind of interest was brewing. Rivals who had long sought a weakness in Stanley Kovac's armor now saw a potential chink. They saw a woman with a past, a name tied to a spectacular fortune that had, to the minds of many, simply vanished into thin air. The first tremor came in the form of whispers. Men loyal to Declan O'Malley, a ruthless Irish gangster who controlled the docks, began asking questions. They were casual at first, dropped in conversations with bookies and fences. What happened to all that Beaumont money? A man like that, he'd have something stashed away, wouldn't he? And wouldn't his clever daughter know where? Stanley heard the whispers, of course. He heard everything. He said nothing to Evelyn, but a new, harder edge settled in his watchfulness. He began walking her home personally, to the small, clean boarding house room she'd rented, his imposing figure a silent warning to the shadows that lingered in the gaslit streets. Then the threat escalated from a whisper to a chilling statement. One afternoon, as Evelyn was walking from the bank back to the club, a sleek black Ford Thief swerved violently toward the curb, its horn blaring. It jumped the sidewalk, scattering pedestrians, and screeched to a halt mere inches from where she stood, frozen in shock. The driver, a man with a face like a clenched fist, simply stared at her for a heart-stopping second, a grim smile on his lips, before putting the car in gear and speeding away. It was over in an instant, but the message was as clear as a gunshot. It was a warning, deniable but unmistakable. That night Stanley's calm finally broke. He found her in her office, her hands still trembling as she tried to focus on the ledger. He shut the door behind him, the sound echoing in the small space. "Pack a bag," he said, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. "You're not staying at the boarding house anymore." "What?" "Stanley, I can't." "This isn't a discussion, Evelyn." He cut her off, his dark eyes burning with a cold fire she had never seen before. "O'Malley is testing the waters. He thinks you're my weakness. He's going to find out he's wrong, but until he does, you are not leaving my sight." "Where will I go?" she whispered, her fear mixing with a strange, dizzying sense of being protected. "There's an apartment above the club," he said. "It's mine. You'll stay there. Mickey or one of my other men will be posted outside your door at all times. You will not leave the building without me." It was a prison sentence delivered as a promise of safety. She was being moved from the gilded cage of the club into a smaller, more secure one. But as she looked into his unyielding face, she knew arguing was pointless. She was his asset, and he would protect his assets. The apartment was sparse and masculine, a reflection of the man himself. It was dominated by a large desk, more bookshelves, and a window that offered the same panoramic, godlike view of the city as his office. There was a simple bedroom with a bed neatly made, and a small kitchen. It smelled of hemorrh cedar, old paper, and stale cigarette smoke. Being there felt like an impossibly intimate intrusion, as if she had been allowed into the guarded inner sanctum of his mind. The days that followed were a strange blend of confinement and connection. Trapped within the walls of the gilded cage, their orbits shrank until they were constantly overlapping. They worked together in his office, ate quiet meals together in his apartment, and stood side by side watching the club from the balcony in the evenings. The professional distance between them dissolved, eroded by proximity and a shared sense of siege. She saw the man behind the myth. She saw the weariness in his eyes after a long night of dealing with the violent politics of his empire. She saw the way his hands, capable of such brutality, could be surprisingly gentle as he straightened a stack of papers. He, in turn, saw the resilience that had replaced her grief. He saw the sharp, strategic mind that lay behind her beautiful face. One night, long after the last employee had gone home, they sat in the quiet of his apartment, a bottle of Stanley's best whiskey on the table between them. The city lights glittered below, a cold and distant galaxy. "I don't understand," Evelyn said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. She stared into her glass, swirling the amber liquid. "Why are they so convinced my father hid money? I was there. I saw the books. The creditors took everything. There was nothing left." Stanley was silent for a long time, watching her with that unnerving intensity. "Because a fortune like your father's doesn't just disappear from a few bad deals, Evelyn," he said softly. "But it did," she insisted, the old pain and confusion welling up inside her. "He wasn't himself in those last months. He was distracted. He made terrible decisions. He trusted the wrong people." Stanley leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "He didn't trust the wrong people. He was cornered by them. Your father's ruin wasn't a series of mistakes. It was a demolition. It was planned piece by people he thought were his friends." Evelyn looked up, her heart beginning to pound. "What are you saying?" He took a deep breath, the confession of a man who dealt only in hard, ugly truths. "The bad investments your father made. He was pushed into them. The friends who advised him were deliberately giving him false information, setting him up to fail. When he tried to pull out, they threatened him. They threatened his reputation. They threatened you." The air in the room grew thin, hard to breathe. Evelyn felt a cold dread creep up her spine, a horror far worse than the simple sorrow of financial ruin. "Who?" she managed to whisper. "Who would do that?" Stanley's dark eyes held hers, and in them she saw the final devastating piece of the puzzle fall into place. He didn't even have to say the name. "Walter DeWitt," he said, his voice flat and hard as granite. "His family wanted a controlling interest in Beaumont shipping for years. Your father refused to sell, so Walter fed your father's rivals information. He pointed out the weak spots, the deals that could be leveraged, the contracts that could be broken. He orchestrated the entire collapse from the inside, all while smiling in your face and planning your wedding. He intended to break your father, force him into a desperate merger, and then step in like a savior to pick up the pieces with you as part of the deal." The world tilted on its axis. Every memory she had of her final year in her old life was suddenly cast in a sickening, sinister light. Walter's reassuring words to her father, his concern over the finances, his sudden public betrayal, it wasn't a reaction to her family's fall. It was the final triumphant act of a long and brutal campaign. "My father," she choked out, the image of his hollowed-out, broken form flashing in her mind. He hadn't failed. He'd been murdered in every way but the physical. "He was a strong man," Stanley said, a rare note of respect in his voice. "He fought them until the very end. That's why they had to destroy him so completely, to make an example of him." The grief she had been carrying for months transformed in that instant. The deep, aching sorrow turned brittle, then superheated until it finally combusted into a pure, clean flame of rage. The tears that filled her eyes were not of sadness, but of fury. She was not the daughter of a failure. She was the daughter of a warrior who had fallen in a battle no one knew he was fighting. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the indifferent city that had borne witness to her family's execution. The woman who had wept over a lost fortune was gone. The girl who had been broken by public humiliation was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone forged in the fire of Stanley's terrible truth. Her past was not a source of shame. It was a declaration of war, and Walter DeWitt had just become an enemy. The truth, once revealed, was a poison that burned away the last vestiges of the old Evelyn Beaumont. Grief had made her a survivor, but rage was forging her into a weapon. The quiet, efficient manager of the Gilded Cage was replaced by a woman with a chilling sense of purpose. Her mind, once occupied with ledgers and inventory, now raced with strategies, mapping out the intricate web of alliances and enmities that defined the city's elite. The world that had cast her out was about to become a hunting ground. She was no longer Stanley's assets to be protected. She became his strategist, his partner in a far more dangerous game. They spent their nights in his office, the air thick with smoke and the scent of whiskey, poring over stock reports, society pages, and Stanley's own network of whispered intelligence. She knew these people. She knew their vanities, their secret debts, their carefully concealed indiscretions. She had danced with their sons and taken tea with their wives. She knew which judge had a weakness for young dancers, which banker was leveraged to the hilt, and which politician's wife was having an affair with her chauffeur. Walter's power doesn't come from his own brilliance, she explained one night, her finger tracing the lines of a family tree in a society register. It comes from the perception of DeWitt invincibility. His father, Clarence, is the real force, but Clarence is old school. He despises scandal. He believes the DeWitt name is sacred. Stanley listened, his dark eyes narrowed in concentration. He was a master of the city's underbelly, but this world of debutante balls and yacht clubs was foreign territory. Evelyn was his guide, his interpreter. "We don't attack Walter directly," she continued, her voice low and steady. "We attack his foundations. We create whispers, suggest instability. We use their own rules, the fear of social ruin against them." A new dynamic took hold between them. They were no longer just a boss and his employee, or a protector and his ward. They were two minds working as one, their shared purpose forging a bond more profound than any romance she had ever imagined. She saw the admiration in his eyes when she dismantled an enemy's business plan, and he saw the fierce, unyielding strength that had been buried beneath layers of silk and propriety. The first move was subtle. Evelyn, using a discreet back channel, leaked a piece of information about a rival of Walter's planning a hostile takeover of a small but significant shipping company. The information was true, but she framed it to look as though it had come from Walter himself, a treacherous move to weaken an associate. The seed of doubt was planted. In the cutthroat world of high finance, a hint of betrayal was as good as a confession. To cement her new role, to make a statement the entire city would understand, Stanley made a decision that was both audacious and brilliant. The annual Starlight Gala for the city orphanage was the pinnacle of the social season, an event from which Evelyn had been brutally excised. This year, she would not be absent. She would be the main event. "You can't be serious, Stanley," she said, staring at the engraved invitation he'd placed on her desk. "They'll turn us away at the door." "No, they won't," he said, a rare, cold smile touching his lips. "I've made a donation to the orphanage. A very, very large one. The kind of donation that buys a seat at the head table. They will welcome us with open arms, and they will choke on their smiles while they do it, the night of the gala." Evelyn stood before the full-length mirror in Stanley's apartment, a stranger to herself. The dress he had procured for her was a masterpiece of shimmering black silk, cut low in the back and adorned with a cascade of jet beads that whispered with her every movement. Diamonds, cold and brilliant, glittered at her throat and ears, not the delicate heirlooms of her past, but bold, formidable jewels that spoke of power, not pedigree. Her dark hair was styled in a sleek, severe wave, and her lips were painted a defiant, blood red. She was not the charming debutante they remembered. She was a queen returning to survey a conquered land. Stanley stood in the doorway, watching her. He was dressed in a tuxedo that seemed molded to his powerful frame, his presence a stark, magnetic contrast to the polished men they were about to face. His eyes swept over her, and for a moment the iron control he maintained seemed to crack, revealing a raw, possessive admiration that made the air between them crackle. "They won't know what hit them," he murmured, his voice a low growl. When they entered the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, a wave of silence followed them. It was the same silence that had consumed her at her own party, but this time it was not born of pity or scorn. It was born of shock, of fear, and of a grudging, undeniable respect. Evelyn Beaumont, the ruined heiress, had returned from the dead, and on the arm of the city's most feared man, she looked anything but ruined. She looked untouchable. She held her head high, her gaze sweeping over the familiar faces of her former friends. She saw the open-mouthed shock on the faces of the women who had cut her dead, the nervous, shifting eyes of the men who had profited from her family's demise. She did not offer a single smile. Her expression was one of cool, regal indifference. She was no longer seeking their approval. She was there to witness their discomfort. And then she saw him. Walter DeWitt stood, with his father, near the orchestra, a glass of champagne frozen halfway to his lips. His face was a mask of disbelief and fury. As Stanley led her toward their table, the head table, as promised, they passed him. Evelyn met his gaze, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. He saw what she had become. He saw the power she now wielded. He saw the man at her side, a man who would not hesitate to burn Walter's entire world to the ground for her. The power was intoxicating, a heady, potent wine. All night, people who had once shunned her approached their table, their greetings fawning and nervous. She was polite, distant, and utterly in control. She was the star of the evening, not for her beauty or her charm, but for the dangerous aura that now surrounded her. Later, as the orchestra played a slow, haunting waltz, Stanley stood and extended his hand to her. "Dance with me, Evelyn." On the dance floor, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, she felt a profound sense of release. In Stanley's arms, she was anchored, secure. He was not a graceful dancer like Walter. His movements were deliberate, strong, and possessive. His hand at the small of her back was a brand, a claim. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and he would kill anyone who tried to take her from him. The music, the lights, the whispers, it all faded away until there was only the two of them. She looked up into his dark, intense eyes and saw the raw, unspoken emotion that had been simmering between them for months. The loyalty, the respect, the fierce protectiveness, it had all coalesced into something deeper, something undeniable. He lowered his head, his lips just a breath from hers. "You were magnificent tonight," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "You made me magnificent," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. When they returned to the apartment in the early hours of the morning, the tension that had been humming between them finally snapped. As he closed the door, shutting out the world, he turned to face her. The city lights behind him framed him in silhouette, a dark angel in his own private heaven. He moved toward her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He raised a hand and gently, almost reverently, traced the line of her jaw. The simple touch was an inferno against her skin. "Evelyn," he breathed her name, and it was both a question and a prayer. She gave her answer by leaning into his touch, closing her eyes and rising on her toes to meet his lips. The kiss was not gentle or hesitant. It was a collision, a release of all the pent-up passion, danger, and desperation that had defined their lives. It tasted of whiskey and victory, of shadows and starlight. It was the sealing of their pact, not in business or survival, but in a love that had been forged in the heart of the fire. In that moment, she was not just untouchable. She was his, and he was hers. Their victory at the gala was a public declaration of war, and Walter DeWitt was not a man who accepted defeat. Stripped of his social standing and facing the quiet, corrosive distrust of his peers, his ambition curdled into a venomous desperation. Declan O'Malley, equally humiliated by Stanley's growing power, saw his own empire threatened. Their shared enemy forged a depraved and volatile alliance, born not of loyalty, but of mutual ruin. They knew they could not attack Stanley's operations directly. He was a fortress. So they chose to strike at his heart. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. Evelyn, feeling the first real sense of security she'd known in months, had convinced Stanley to let her visit a small, trusted dressmaker in a quiet part of town, escorted by two of his best men. It was a sliver of normalcy, a chance to feel like the woman she once was. But as she stepped out of the seamstress's shop, a large, black sedan screeched to a halt beside her guard's car, boxing it in. Before her men could even draw their weapons, two figures emerged from the sedan, brandishing Thompson submachine guns. It was a display of overwhelming force designed to prevent a fight. Simultaneously, a second car pulled up to the curb where Evelyn stood frozen. A side door flew open. A hand shot out, clamping a chloroform-soaked rag over her mouth and nose. The world dissolved into a sickeningly sweet chemical haze, her last conscious thought a silent scream of Stanley's name. She awoke to a throbbing headache and the damp, bone-deep chill of decay. Her hands were bound tightly behind a wooden chair. She was in a vast, cavernous space, an abandoned warehouse on the waterfront. Judging by the smell of briny rot and the mournful sound of a distant foghorn. A single bare bulb hanging from the rafters cast long, distorted shadows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. Across from her, lounging on a stack of crates, was Declan O'Malley, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. Standing near the grimy, weeping windows was Walter DeWitt. He paced back and forth like a caged tiger, his expensive suit looking comically out of place in the filth. "She's awake," O'Malley grunted, not looking up. Walter spun around, his face a twisted mask of triumph and rage. "Welcome, Evelyn. I do apologize for the accommodations. They're a far cry from the plaza, I'm afraid." "What do you want, Walter?" Evelyn's voice was hoarse, but steady. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her fury was a fire that burned hotter. "What do I want?" He laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "I want what's mine. I want to see your gutter king grovel. I want to see him broken, just as he broke me in front of everyone. You are the bait, my dear. We've sent him a little note, an invitation to a party. If he wants to see you alive again, he'll come here, alone." "He won't come," Evelyn lied, her heart sinking. She knew he would. That was the terrible, beautiful certainty of it. "Oh, he'll come," O'Malley said, finally looking at her with his dead, shark-like eyes. "Men like him have a code, and women like you are the part of the code that gets them killed." Evelyn was not the damsel from the storybooks. She did not weep or plead. Her mind, honed by weeks of strategic thinking, went to work. She took in every detail of her prison, the rickety stacks of crates, the rusty chains hanging from the ceiling, the oil slick on the concrete floor near a forgotten barrel. She tested the ropes on her wrists, not with brute force, but with small, methodical movements, searching for any give. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the drip of water from the ceiling and Walter's incessant, nervous pacing. They were waiting. and so was she. Finally, the silence was broken by the sound of a single car approaching, its engine cutting out in the alley outside. Walter's face lit up with a predatory glee. O'Malley stood, pocketing his knife and nodding to two of his thugs, who melted into the deeper shadows, guns ready. The great rolling door of the warehouse groaned open a few feet, and a silhouette filled the gap. It was Stanley. He was alone. He stepped inside, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, though his face showed no fear. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, immediately found Evelyn, a flicker of raw, murderous rage passing through them before being banked by an iron will. Kovac, punctual, O'Malley sneered. I like that in a man. It makes his execution so much more convenient. Let her go. O'Malley. Stanley's voice was a low rumble, a promise of violence held barely in check. Your business is with me. My business is with whatever gives me an advantage, O'Malley retorted. And right now, she's my advantage. Walter stepped forward, savoring his moment. It's over, Kovac. You built an empire in the filth, but tonight you die in it. And she watched. Stanley's gaze remained fixed on Evelyn. It was a silent communication. Stay ready. Evelyn knew this was her only chance. While Walter and O'Malley were focused on Stanley, their victory seemingly assured, she acted. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw her weight backward, toppling the chair she was tied to. She crashed onto the concrete floor with a sickening thud, the impact jarring her to the bone. But her target was not the floor. The leg of her chair slammed into the base of a tall, precariously balanced stack of wooden crates beside her. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of stressed wood, the entire stack listed and then collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a tidal wave of splintering wood and dust directly into the path of O'Malley's hidden gunman. It was the chaos Stanley needed. In the split second of distraction, he moved. He was not a man. He was a blur of contained fury. He dropped and rolled, a pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. 2 shots, deafening in the enclosed space, and O'Malley's men fell from the shadows. O'Malley himself let out a roar of rage and dove for cover, firing blindly. Walter, coward that he was, simply stood frozen in terror. Stanley was already on his feet, moving through the dust and chaos like a wraith. He ignored O'Malley, who was now pinned down. His sole objective was across the room. He reached Walter in 3 long strides, grabbing him by the front of his jacket and slamming him against a steel support pillar. The gun in Stanley's hand was pressed hard against Walter's temple. This is for her father, Stanley snarled, his voice a guttural expression of pure hatred. This is for her, Walter whimpered, his face ashen, his arrogance completely shattered. Please, don't. Stanley's thumb cocked the hammer. Vengeance was a heartbeat away. The city would call it a gangland killing, and justice, in its own brutal way, would be served. Stanley. Evelyn's voice cut through the red haze of his rage. She had struggled halfway out of her ropes, her face bruised, her eyes pleading. But she was not pleading for Walter's life. She was pleading for his soul. Her gaze was not one of fear, but of an unwavering faith in the man he was, not the killer he was capable of becoming. She was his anchor, pulling him back from the abyss. His hand trembled, the battle for his conscience playing out in the tense muscles of his arm. He looked from Walter's pathetic, terrified face to Evelyn's strong, trusting one. Killing Walter would be easy. It would be satisfying. But it would be an ending written in their world, the world of blood and shadows. She deserved more. She deserved a justice born of the light. With a final, ragged breath, he lowered the gun. He did not release Walter. Instead, he slammed his fist into Walter's jaw, a single, concise act of retribution that sent him crumpling to the floor, unconscious. From the other side of the warehouse, O'Malley saw his advantage was lost. He fired one last desperate shot before scrambling out a side door and disappearing into the night. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by their heavy breathing. Stanley rushed to Evelyn's side, his hands surprisingly gentle as he cut the ropes from her wrists. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her tightly, his face buried in her hair. It was not the embrace of a rescuer and a victim. It was the embrace of two soldiers who had survived a war together. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "No," he said, his voice rough as he pulled back to look at her. "It's not over. It's finished." He gestured with his head toward the door, where two of his men, having dealt with the guards outside, now stood waiting. In one of their hands was a leather briefcase. "My men paid a visit to O'Malley's accountant while he was busy here, and to Walter's office. We have everything. Ledgers, letters, sworn affidavits. Enough to ensure that Walter DeWitt and his father will not just be ruined, but publicly disgraced. He won't go to jail for kidnapping you, but he will be destroyed by the evidence of what he did to your father. He won't die tonight. He'll spend the rest of his life wishing he had. He had chosen her justice over his own vengeance, a fate worse than death for a man like Walter DeWitt. He had chosen to be the man she believed him to be. The city was a beast that never slept, but in the hushed, grey moments just before dawn, it seemed to hold its breath. From the large window of Stanley's apartment, the first pale fingers of light were beginning to stretch across the sky, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of lavender and rose. The Hudson River was a ribbon of dark silk, slowly catching the light. The clamor of the night had faded, and a fragile peace settled over the skyline. Evelyn stood at the window, wrapped in one of Stanley's silk dressing gowns, a glass of whiskey warming her hands. The events of the warehouse felt like a fever dream, a violent, chaotic nightmare from which she had finally awoken. Her body ached, a deep, weary soreness that was more than just physical, but her mind was clear, calmer than it had been in years. Behind her, Stanley moved with a quiet purpose. He had already set his world back in order. Declan O'Malley, stripped of his ledgers and betrayed by his panicked underlings, was a ghost, already fleeing the city with a price on his head. The evidence against the DeWitts had been delivered anonymously to the desk of the most tenacious reporter at the New York Tribune. By noon, the name that had once been a bastion of high society would be synonymous with fraud and disgrace. The wheels of a different, more public kind of justice were already turning. He came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, comforting anchor in the shifting tides of her new reality. "The papers will call it a miracle," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The lost Beaumont records, mysteriously found. Proof of a conspiracy. Your father's name will be cleared, completely." She nodded, leaning her head against the cool glass of the window. "A miracle orchestrated by a gangster." A small, sad smile touched her lips. He would have appreciated the irony. She was silent for a moment, watching the city awaken. "And what happens now, to me?" It was the question that had hung in the air between them since they had returned from the warehouse. Her past was redeemed. Her name was restored. The gilded cage was no longer a sanctuary. Its door was now wide open. Stanley took a deep breath, and it seemed to cost him something. "Whatever you want," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're Evelyn Beaumont again. Not my manager. Not my anything. Just Evelyn Beaumont. The world that threw you out will be begging you to come back. They'll welcome you with open arms. You can have it all back. The galas, the parties, the life you were meant to have." He was offering her an exit, an escape. It was the most selfless, most difficult thing he could possibly do. He was offering to let her go, to return her to the light. even if it meant he would be left alone in the shadows. He was giving her back the life he had inadvertently helped take from her. Evelyn turned from the window to face him. She looked into his dark, guarded eyes and saw the truth of his sacrifice. He expected her to leave. He believed it was the best thing for her. And perhaps the old Evelyn, the girl who had dreamed of a perfect society wedding, would have. But she was not that girl anymore. "And you, Stanley," she asked softly, "where do you fit into that world? Would you escort me to tea at the plaza? Discuss the stock market with my old friends? Would you be happy in that world of polite lies and hidden daggers?" He didn't have to answer. The grim set of his jaw was answer enough. He was a creature of the night, of hard truths and brutal loyalties. He would suffocate in the rarefied air of her old life. "That world doesn't exist for me anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong, leaving no room for doubt. "It's a ghost, a memory. They didn't abandon me, Stanley. They exposed themselves for what they are, shallow, cruel, and weak. Why would I ever want to go back?" She took a step closer to him, closing the small space he had so carefully put between them. She reached up and laid her hand against his cheek, the slight roughness of his stubble a grounding, real sensation. "My life isn't in those empty ballrooms. It's not in a name printed in the society pages. My life is here." Her gaze was unwavering. "In a smoky room filled with jazz music and illegal gin. My life is at a ledger in a cramped office, making an empire run. My life is with the man who saw me when I was invisible to everyone else, the man who taught me how to fight, the man who was willing to start a war for me." A storm of emotions crossed Stanley's face: disbelief, hope, and a deep, soul-shaking vulnerability she had never seen before. The gangster, the king of the underworld, was stripped bare in that moment, revealing the man underneath who had never believed he was worthy of the light. "Evelyn," he breathed her name, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide. "I am not your prisoner, Stanley Kovac," she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "I am not your ward. I am your partner. This," she gestured around the apartment, toward the city, toward the club below. "This is my home now. The gilded cage isn't my prison. It's my throne, and I have no intention of abdicating." He finally closed his eyes, a single shuddering breath escaping him as the weight of his own sacrifice was lifted. When he opened them again, they were shining with a fierce, brilliant light. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch both infinitely gentle and fiercely possessive. "Then be my queen," he murmured, and he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion like the one after the gala, nor one of violent relief like in the warehouse. It was a kiss of beginning. It was a promise made as the sun rose over the Hudson, washing the city in the clean, bright light of a new day. It was the quiet, unshakable foundation of an empire built not on inheritance or deceit, but on scars, on loyalty, and on a love that had been forged, tested, and proven in the deepest, darkest fires. True value is not measured by the height of one's social standing, but by the strength of one's character in the depths of ruin. It teaches us that the greatest love isn't found in perfect ballrooms, but is often forged in the shadows, with the one person who sees the unbreakable spirit within, when all others see is a fallen angel. True power is not inherited, it is seized, and the most unshakable empires are built on a foundation of loyalty, scars, and a love that chooses its own kingdom. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.